It's a wild world out there, but some worlds are even wilder. Hi, I'm Tyler Habney, and you're listening to Dungeons and Dystopias. Thank you for listening. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Dungeons and Dystopias. I am your host and game master, Tyler Habney. I have game mastered over 200 sessions combined of Cyberpunk Red and Dungeons and Dragons, and this podcast is a way for me to reflect some of my thoughts on those systems. Today's episode is going to be on Dungeons and Dragons, and it is going to be another setting episode where we're going to be talking about some of my, I guess, one of my favorite Dungeons and Dragons settings. And it's not the Forgotten Realms, though it is somewhat connected to the Forgotten Realms, depending on what kind of campaign you're playing. But it's more, I guess, ethereal than that. Multiplanar would be the way to describe it perfectly. And honestly, really, there's a lot that could go into this particular setting. We could probably talk about it for multiple episodes, and we very well might. You never know. But for now, this is our first episode, or so far only episode on Sigil. And it is spelled Sigil, S-I-G-I-L, but as I understand it, the guy that made the setting did not know how to properly pronounce that word, and so he very boldly said it was Sigil, and that has sort of become the, I guess, sort of the pronunciation of it. Though technically you're really allowed to pronounce it however you want. For the purposes of this podcast, we will be pronouncing it the wrong way, which is the right way, and that is Sigil. Of course, this has no, well, it might, I don't know, but it doesn't have any relation. We won't be talking about the Dungeons & Dragons Wizards of the Coast Project Sigil, Project Sigil. I'm not quite sure on that one. That is, it appears to be mostly defunct at this point, but that was Wizards of the Coast's attempt to do a virtual tabletop. Did not work out well for them. So we're not going to be talking about that very much, but we will be talking mostly about the city of Sigil, and not really even talking about what's happening outside the city. That could be its own episode on its own. There's a lot going on in this setting. But the basic gist that we have to start with is that Sigil is part of a setting called Planescape. And if you've been around the block with Dungeons and Dragons, you have probably heard the name Planescape talked about a few times. Maybe a friend has brought it up, or maybe you've sort of gotten into the old Baldur's Gate games, and you've heard stories about a certain video game called Planescape Torment. That I'd say that's probably Planescape's biggest claim to fame, is that video game, and it's a very well written video game, very good. I'd recommend playing it if you're into those old school CRPGs. It's very far cry from how Baldur's Gate 3 plays, but if you are very into that style of game, it should provide a pretty good time. At least if you really like writing and philosophy and video games, Planescape Torment is right up your alley. In fact, the whole Planescape setting is up your alley, but we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves there. We'll come back to it. Planescape is essentially, in Dungeons & Dragons, the center of the D&D multiverse, and that is another thing we could do an entire episode on. There are so many planes in Dungeons & Dragons, but really, all you need to know is that there is a large multiverse. And since we're in 5e, and you know, this is the one I kind of go with, we're going to prescribe to the idea that in D&D the universe is like a great wheel. And you know, with any wheel you have spokes that are attached to a central position. Now, in the Dungeons and Dragons multiverse, that central position is the material plane, Forgotten Realms, Faerun, wherever you want to put it, but it's the material plane. Well, how I've heard it described before is that Sigil is what's behind that center plate. There's something going on back there that's maybe holding the center plate up, or it's a sort of like a crankshaft, a turn or a piston or something that's maintaining everything, and that is Sigil. It's the backstage to Dungeons and Dragons, and I think that is a Brennan Lee Mulligan quote. He does a pretty good few minute videos on Sigil for the D&D YouTube channel. That was a collaboration they did with the new Sigil campaign they released for 5e. But Sigil as a setting goes back decades. It's an old one for sure. And I know for some people calling it old might be a little hurtful, but it is compared to a lot of the current modern D&D settings that people are really getting into, like Exandria and stuff. It is old. It's well formed. It has quite a lot of lore to it. In fact, some of the most important D&D lore happens around Sigil. The whole 3.5e into 4e shift, I think, was, or was that 2e into 3e? It was something, but the last time Vecna came through Sigil, an entire edition, we had an entire edition change. So it's definitely a place where a lot of kooky stuff can happen, and a lot of high stakes campaigns. Now, I mentioned earlier, a few minutes ago, that Planescape is a very political setting, very philosophical. Maybe not necessarily political, but very philosophical. It has to be, because Sigil does not have a unifying law, or law and order, basically. It doesn't have a police system. They have factions that have taken to themselves to make themselves police, effectively, but not necessarily a royal guard that works for a monarchy. In fact, there really isn't a monarchy in Sigil to begin with. There's this figure in charge called the Lady of Pain. She is, I would consider, one of the most neutral beings in the entire D&D multiverse. She does not like the worship of gods within her city. She doesn't like the presence of gods within her city. And she especially does not like it if you worship her like a god. The preferred method of punishment for people who worship the Lady of Pain, as if she is a deity, is to be imprisoned in an eternal maze, a labyrinth that you can never escape from, without crazy magical means. But still, she can flay you alive by just looking at you. She's extremely enigmatic, hard to tell exactly what she wants. Don't approach her. Just don't do it. Lady of Pain. But she does not have a royal guard. She has things called dabases, who are more like servants, public workers. They don't exactly, they're not running around with the hat and billy club and beating a mind flayer for stealing some bread. It's a lot more complicated than that, because the people who do claim power in Sigil are all representatives of different schools of thought within the city. There's like 8 or 9, or there's quite a bit of them. And over the editions, some of them have shown up and some of them have disappeared. So it is kind of, depending on which edition you're in, kind of goes to, it helps out to try to read up on the lore of these certain factions. But what do I mean by schools of thought? Well, for instance, there's a faction called the Heralds of Dust, the Dustmen, who are very nihilistic, to the point where they're almost Buddhist in tone, with the way they view life and everything around them. There's another faction, the Sensates, that is all about, you can't learn things unless you experience them for yourself. So the Sensates are always about finding new sensations, and that can typically make them pretty, what's the word? hedonistic would be the word I would use for it. Basically, they seek sensation above all else. But you get the idea. I'm not going to go through every single faction because that would be an entire 20 minutes on its own, probably more. But generally, it's all these different styles of thinking. There's a faction that's objectivist in nature. There's a faction that's more peaceful. There's a faction that's, they don't necessarily even believe in gods in D&D. They have somehow managed to make an atheist faction in Dungeons and Dragons, which is, a setting where the gods are confirmed to be alive. So how do you make an atheist? Well, those particular people, they believe that gods aren't really anything divine to be worshipped, but are instead usually adventurers of some kind or some person who's ascended. So really, they're not divine, they're not really worth that, at least in these people's eyes. But all these different people have split Sigil up into sort of these various different areas and spots, and obviously there's better parts of town, there's worse parts of town, but it kind of comes together to form this weird society, because the backbone of Sigil is that it is the center of the multiverse. It is the one area where you can find, it's a city of doors. It's a city of portals where you can basically just open some door that hasn't been opened in, 20 years and find, oh, actually it's a portal to the 9 hells, and it's just kind of sitting there, and good luck finding your way back from Sigil, because guess what? You can't teleport there by command. The Lady of Pain does not allow teleportation in or out of the city. So the only way to get to Sigil is to know how to get there through the various portals that are all over the city. And I personally think this can lead to fun situations in current campaigns where, maybe they might manage to open a door to Sigil. I think that could be interesting. Just have a quick Sigil campaign session and then back right where you were. Oh man, there's a lot to go in with Sigil. I could, like I said, probably multiple episodes on this. I'd personally read through all of the different factions and their belief systems. Sigil has it. Planescape and Sigil has its own lore, its own slang, where you can look up a guidebook. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on the slang, but it almost feels very Clockwork Orange in a sense, where you're basically learning this entire new dialect just to try to kind of understand the people you're talking to, because sometimes it can be that crazy of a difference or a sort of slang differences in dialect. But yeah, wow, Sigil it's great. It really is. As a setting location in itself, I mean, the city is big enough, thick enough. It has enough in there to warrant a campaign all on its own. You technically do not have to leave Sigil at all to have a pretty satisfying campaign. But I mean, if you go to Sigil and you don't wind up going to at least one other different plane, what are you doing? I mean, you're just using Sigil for all the different crazy, wacky creatures that are running about, like, a Yeti bartender or something like that, which is great, which is awesome. Those are really cool ideas, but at the same time, Sigil is the city of doors, and you should use at least one or two of those doors if you're running a campaign in Sigil. That's just my 2 cents. When it comes to Sigil as well, I think it is important to keep in mind that it's a little bit more of a, I don't want to call it visceral, but I used the word ethereal earlier, and that is, I think that's a good kind of way to talk about it. It's a lot more thinking involved and a lot more social stuff involved than it might be in your typical Forgotten Realms campaign, because I mean, in Planescape, in Sigil, you can run into any creature pretty much of any kind because everything's neutral in Sigil. You know, it's you can basically just run into any type of creature there. So you might run into a Demi-Lich that like does your taxes, and if you make the Demi-Lich angry, well, it's like a CR30 creature. You gotta kind of rely a little bit more on your words than you might approach something like you would in Skyrim or your typical D&D campaign where sword and board. If it looks angry, kill it. That does not work in Sigil. It certainly doesn't. And it adds a sort of extra dimension to everything there. But yeah, I think for now we're going to move on to our monster of the week. 100% would encourage you, if Sigil sounds at all interesting to you, please look into Planescape. It's such an insane setting. Probably one of my favorites. More than Forgotten Realms? I'd say so. Honestly, there's a lot of opportunity there, but it is a completely different style of game than your typical normal fantasy Forgotten Realms ordeal that a lot of people are, probably going to Dungeons and Dragons primarily for, which is not a problem, but there are other crazier options out there that I think might even be a little better. So there. Anyways, Monster of the Week. Today's Monster of the Week, I've decided, because we haven't done a ton of super crazy, awesome giant monsters, we're going to talk a little bit about Ettins. Yeah, these guys are a sort of type of hill giant. I don't know if they're necessarily considered a giant themselves. I mean, they are, but I don't know necessarily how the bloodline works here. But basically, an Ettin is technically two giants. If we really want to talk about this, technically it's two giants. But an Ettin is a conjoined twin of two giants. So it's one body with two heads, and they're both very different from each other. Typically, a lot of times, even dungeon masters, as well as lore and pretty much any other type of media that's ever had an Ettin in it, will have the two heads fight over some trivial thing. Like, I don't know, maybe one of them wants more meat off the bone or whatever. And they have, the hands fight each other. It's very silly, very goofy. But that's kind of just a part of Ettin culture, being stuck next to a guy that is technically your brother for your entire life and just kind of chillaxing. I don't know. I'd probably get a little angry sometimes too. But Ettins are unclean. They're angry. They are dumb, stupid, brutish. Yeah, wow. They're really they don't have a ton of great things about them, other than the fact that they are insanely strong. They don't necessarily perceive diplomacy as good. In fact, typically, when you meet an Ettin, it's going to be more likely to smash you with a big stick than it is to try to discuss anything with you. So, be careful of Ettins with giant sticks. Other than that, Ettins are, they're pretty solitary creatures. You don't typically see Ettins in large groups. Typically, they're just kind of on their own. Before, I've had Ettins who will be just out in the woods, minding herds of sheep or whatever, which, even if it is an Ettin, sometimes they do be farming. Sometimes they do be keeping pets and stuff because they need food and, all that business. But yeah, talking about Ettins in terms of mechanics, they don't actually have a ton that is important. One being that they have advantage on perception checks because technically they have 4 eyes. They have advantage on saving throws against being blind, charmed, deafened, frightened, stunned, and knocked unconscious because, once again, 2 heads equals technically 2 people. And then last but not least, and this is it for their traits. The rest of their stuff is mostly weapons. They have the wakeful trait, which allows them to always be awake no matter what. One of their heads, even if one is sleeping, the other one is awake. And that is an Etten. They're pretty normal, pretty basic creatures, but I think can be pretty handy if used the right way. So that is going to be it for us this week. Thank you so much for listening and tuning in to Dungeons and Dystopias. This is episode 23, which is pretty crazy to me. But yeah, I'm Tyler Habney, and this has been Dungeons and Dystopias. Thank you so much for listening.